We all know the story. It's been immortalized in cinema, celebrated in Passover cedars, and preached from pulpits for millennia. The epic tale of Moses leading his people out of bondage, of plagues raining down on oppressors, of waters miraculously parting to allow escape. The Exodus? Perhaps the most influential liberation narrative ever told. But what if I told you that this cherished story has a much darker side than Sunday school lessons reveal? What if this foundation myth, this cornerstone of Western religious tradition, contains elements so troubling that they're routinely glossed over or ignored entirely? And what if virtually none of it actually happened? Today, we're pulling back the veil on the Exodus, examining both its historical credibility and its moral shadows. We'll confront the disturbing reality that this beloved tale includes divine-sanctioned mass infanticide, a God who deliberately hardens hearts to justify punishment, and a conquest narrative that reads like a Bronze Age genocide handbook. We'll explore why mainstream archaeologists and historians have concluded that the Exodus, as described in the Bible, simply never occurred, despite over a century of searching for evidence. This journey may challenge deeply held beliefs, but understanding the difference between myth and history and confronting the ethical questions these ancient texts raise matters. Because stories shape us, they form our moral compass, and sometimes the most important stories to examine critically are the ones we've been taught never to question. Let's first establish what the biblical narrative claims happened. According to the book of Exodus, the Hebrews lived in Egypt for generations, eventually becoming enslaved. When a pharaoh orders the murder of all Hebrew baby boys, one child, Moses, is hidden in a basket and rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. Raised in the royal court, Moses later flees after killing an Egyptian, then returns decades later with a divine mission to free his people. When Pharaoh refuses, God unleashes 10 devastating plagues on Egypt, from rivers turning to blood to locusts devouring crops. The final plague is the most horrific, the death of every firstborn Egyptian child and animal. Only after this mass death does Pharaoh relent. The Hebrews escape, but Pharaoh's army pursues them to the Red Sea, where Moses parts the waters, allowing his people to cross safely while the Egyptian forces drown. The liberated Hebrews then spend 40 years wandering the desert, receiving the 10 Commandments, and eventually, under Joshua's leadership, conquer the land of Canaan city by city, often slaughtering entire populations, men, women, children, even livestock, at divine command. It's a sweeping epic of divine intervention, liberation, and promised land. Now for the historical reality. After more than a century of archaeological exploration in Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, and throughout the Levant, the scholarly consensus is crystal clear. There is no evidence that the Exodus, as described in the Bible, ever occurred. No Egyptian records mention Hebrew slaves, Moses, or catastrophic plagues that would have devastated the region's superpower. No archaeological remains mark the passage of hundreds of thousands of people through the Sinai desert for 40 years. No destruction layers in Canaanite cities match the biblical conquest timeline. Instead, the evidence suggests something far different. The people who became the Israelites were native Canaanites who gradually developed a distinct identity and culture. The Exodus appears to be a founding myth, a powerful story created centuries after its supposed occurrence to forge a national identity. But the historical problems are just the beginning. Let's dive deeper into the moral shadows cast by this cherished tale. The darkness in the Exodus story begins long before Moses. In the biblical narrative, God himself orchestrates the Israelites' enslavement through a complex chain of events. Think about it. According to Genesis, God gives Joseph prophetic dreams, which prompt his brothers' jealousy. They sell him into slavery in Egypt, where God grants him the ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, leading to his elevation to power. Joseph then brings his entire family to Egypt during a famine. Several generations later, this settlement in Egypt transforms into brutal bondage. But this isn't portrayed as mere human cruelty or historical accident. It's presented as divine plan. In Genesis 15:13-14, God tells Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. Let that sink in. The enslavement wasn't prevented by God, it was predicted and permitted by design. The suffering of generations was, according to the text, a predetermined step in God's plan. Hundreds of years of whips on backs, families torn apart, and children born into bondage, all foreknown and incorporated into divine strategy. This raises profound ethical questions. If an all-powerful deity foresaw generations of suffering and allowed it as part of a greater plan, what does that tell us about divine morality? The narrative presents a God who uses human suffering as a means to an end, who permits centuries of agony to set the stage for a dramatic rescue that will demonstrate his power. And the manipulation doesn't end there. When Moses finally returns to Egypt with God's demand to let my people go, we encounter one of the most disturbing aspects of the story: divine mind control. Repeatedly, when Pharaoh considers releasing the Hebrews, God hardens Pharaoh's heart to prevent him from doing so. Exodus 10:1-2 is explicit. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians." The text portrays God actively preventing Pharaoh from making the very choice God is demanding, specifically to create an opportunity for more dramatic displays of power. Pharaoh becomes a puppet whose strings are pulled to ensure maximum suffering, not just for him, but for an entire nation of innocent Egyptians who had no say in their ruler's policies. This leads us directly to the plagues, escalating catastrophes that punish an entire population for the decisions of a ruler who, according to the text, was not even acting of his own free will. The 10 plagues described in Exodus represent escalating ecological and humanitarian disasters. Water turned to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally, death of the firstborn. With each plague, Egyptian suffering intensifies. But who truly suffers in these plagues? Not primarily Pharaoh in his palace. It's the ordinary Egyptian people, farmers whose crops are destroyed, families whose drinking water becomes undrinkable, children who develop painful boils. The plagues target infrastructure, food security, and public health, essentially collective punishment inflicted on an entire population. This culminates in what can only be described as mass infanticide, the killing of every firstborn Egyptian male, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave behind the handmill, and even the firstborn of all the livestock. Imagine this scene. In homes across Egypt, families wake to find their eldest sons mysteriously dead. From royal palace to humble hovel, no household with Egyptian blood is spared. The text tells us, "There was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead." This is presented not as a tragedy, but as divine triumph. The necessary breaking of Pharaoh's will, the death of thousands of innocent children, becomes a means to an end, collateral damage in a divine power demonstration. The firstborn who die include infants, toddlers, and children who had no part in enslaving Hebrews or making policy. They die not for their own actions, but for their identity, for being born Egyptian, for being the firstborn, for being the most effective leverage against their ruler. The narrative never questions the ethics of this. There's no acknowledgement of Egyptian parental grief, no recognition that these children were innocent. Instead, their deaths are portrayed as justified divine retribution, a disturbing moral calculus where children's lives become acceptable currency in a conflict between God and Pharaoh. Even more troubling is how this mass death became celebrated. The Passover celebration commemorates how death passed over Hebrew homes while visiting Egyptian ones. For millennia, this selective slaughter has been remembered with ritual and feasting. The death of Egyptian children transformed into a joyous demonstration of divine favor and protection for the chosen people. Yet beyond the moral questions, we have a historical one. Did this mass killing ever actually occur? Would such an unprecedented demographic catastrophe, the simultaneous death of the eldest child in every Egyptian household, not appear in any Egyptian records? Would it not leave archaeological evidence of mass burials? Would Egyptian society, having lost an entire generation of heirs and significant portions of its workforce and livestock, not show signs of collapse? The silence of history on this matter speaks volumes. After the Exodus and 40 years of desert wandering, the biblical narrative continues with what modern ethical frameworks would classify as ethnic cleansing. The conquest of Canaan, as described in the book of Joshua, includes explicit divine commands to annihilate entire populations. Take Jericho. After the famous wall-collapsing miracle, Joshua 6:21 states, "They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys." Or consider what happens at Ai in Joshua 8:24-25. When Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. The pattern repeats throughout Joshua. City after city falls, and total slaughter is presented as fulfillment of divine will. Deuteronomy 20:16-17 makes the mandate explicit. "In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you." This conquest narrative presents genocide as divinely mandated, the wholesale slaughter of men, women, children, and even animals portrayed as righteous obedience to God. The native inhabitants of Canaan are dehumanized, their extermination justified as divine judgment for their supposedly wicked ways. But did this conquest actually occur? Again, archaeology offers a clear answer: no. The cities allegedly conquered during this period tell a different story through their ruins. Jericho, the first city supposedly conquered in this campaign, wasn't even occupied during the late Bronze Age when the conquest would have occurred. Excavations show it was essentially abandoned during this period. There were no walls to come tumbling down, no city to conquer. Similarly, archaeological evidence at sites like Ai, Gibeon, and other supposedly conquered cities fails to show destruction layers at the appropriate time period. The physical evidence simply doesn't match the biblical account. Instead, archaeological evidence suggests the Israelites gradually emerged from within Canaanite society. The earliest Israelite settlements show cultural continuity with Canaanite material culture, similar pottery, architectural styles, and religious artifacts. The only consistent difference appears to be an absence of pig bones, suggesting a dietary restriction that became a cultural marker. The conquest narrative appears to be a later creation, a violent origin myth that established a clear boundary between Israelite and Canaanite identities that were, in reality, much more fluid and interrelated. Yet despite its historical inaccuracy, this narrative has had real consequences throughout history. It has been invoked to justify colonization and dispossession of indigenous peoples across centuries, with European settlers in America and elsewhere explicitly drawing parallels between themselves and the Israelites, and between native populations and the Canaanites to be displaced. Let's examine the archaeological evidence more closely. After more than a century of extensive excavations specifically looking for evidence of the Exodus, researchers have found nothing to support the biblical account. In Egypt, no inscription, papyrus, or artifact explicitly mentions Israelite slaves, Moses, or the dramatic plagues. Egyptian records from the likely time period, the Late Bronze Age, circa 1550 to 1200 BCE, are extensive. Egypt was meticulous in its record-keeping, yet they contain no reference to these supposedly catastrophic events. Some apologists argue that Egypt wouldn't record embarrassing defeats. However, the scale of disasters described in Exodus, nationwide plagues, the loss of a significant slave population, the drowning of an army, would likely have left some trace, if not in official propaganda, then in the drastic power vacuum afterward. Yet Egyptian power continued uninterrupted during this period. The biblical detail of Hebrews building the city of Ramses points to the era of Pharaoh Ramesses II in the 13th century, century BCE. Yet Egyptian records from that time show no sudden slave escape or nationwide plagues. In fact, just years after the supposed exodus, Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Ramesses II, was campaigning in Canaan, his power clearly undiminished by any recent disasters. The Sinai evidence is equally damning. According to Exodus, hundreds of thousands of people wandered this peninsula for 40 years. Such a massive population would have left substantial archaeological traces, pottery shards, campfire remains, burials, tools. Yet extensive surveys throughout the region have yielded nothing from the late Bronze Age. Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites supposedly camped for 38 years, shows no occupation during this period. The thousands of people who would have died during a 40-year journey have left no graves. The millions of pottery shards that should exist are nowhere to be found. As Israeli archaeologist Zeev Herzog bluntly stated, the Israelites never sojourned in Egypt, did not wander in the desert, and did not conquer the land in a military campaign. The conquest evidence is similarly lacking. Jericho's famous walls had been destroyed much earlier, around 1550 BCE, long before any Israelite conquest could have occurred. By 1200 BCE, when Joshua supposedly attacked, Jericho was either uninhabited or a small, unwalled settlement. Ai, the second city allegedly conquered, was actually abandoned around 2400 BCE, nearly 1,000 years before Joshua. Its name literally means the ruin in Hebrew, suggesting the biblical writers were trying to explain an already ancient, abandoned site they observed. A few sites, like Hazor, do show destruction around the right time period, but these can be attributed to other known historical factors: Sea Peoples invasions, Egyptian campaigns, or internal Canaanite conflicts. Instead of evidence for conquest, archaeology shows that early Israel emerged gradually from within Canaanite society. Early Israelite villages in the Central Highlands show clear cultural continuity with Canaanite predecessors. They used similar pottery, building styles, and even religious symbols. The archaeological consensus is clear. The Exodus and conquest narratives are not literal history, but rather origin myths developed centuries later to forge a national identity. If the Exodus didn't happen as described, how did this powerful story emerge? Scholars have proposed several compelling theories. The most widely accepted view is that the people who became Israel were primarily indigenous Canaanites who gradually developed a distinct identity. During the late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 to 1100 BCE, the Canaanite city-state system broke down. In the Central Highlands of Canaan, new villages appeared with a somewhat distinct culture. These became the early Israelites. But myths of origin rarely acknowledge such gradual, complex processes. Nations tend to create dramatic foundation stories, and the Exodus served this purpose perfectly. Several historical elements likely contributed to this myth's formation. First, there were indeed Semitic peoples in Egypt at various times. The Hyksos, a Semitic people from Canaan, actually ruled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1650 to 1550 BCE, before being expelled by native Egyptian rulers. This expulsion of a Semitic population from Egypt may have provided a historical kernel that evolved into the Exodus story over centuries. Second, small groups of people almost certainly moved between Egypt and Canaan throughout history. The Levites, the priestly class in ancient Israel, notably have many Egyptian-derived names: Moses, Aaron, Phinehas. Some scholars suggest the Levites might have been a small group with Egyptian connections who joined the Highland Israelites, bringing religious practices and stories that eventually spread to the entire population. Third, the Exodus narrative likely crystallized during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. When the Judean elite were taken captive to Babylon, they experienced a national trauma of displacement and captivity, followed by return, a parallel to the Exodus story. This experience may have shaped how they told their origin story, infusing it with themes of captivity and liberation that resonated with their current circumstances. The Exodus narrative appears to have reached its final form during or after this exile period, nearly 700 years after it supposedly occurred. By this time, it was not meant as modern historical documentation, but as a powerful national myth, explaining who the Israelites were and why they had a special relationship with their God. The Exodus story has had an undeniable influence on human history. It has inspired liberation movements, from enslaved African Americans to anti-apartheid activists. Its message that captivity is not the natural state of humanity, that freedom is divine will, has given hope to millions. Yet we cannot ignore its darker elements: divine manipulation, mass infanticide, and genocidal conquest narratives. These aspects have also influenced history, providing religious justification for colonization, conquest, and mistreatment of others. The moral challenge of the Exodus is to reckon with both its liberatory power and its ethical shadows. Can we extract the inspiring core of freedom from bondage while rejecting the violent tribalism that accompanies it in the text? Can we acknowledge the story's profound cultural impact while honestly confronting its historical inaccuracy? Myths are not necessarily falsehoods. They are stories that express deeper truths about human experience and identity. The Exodus myth captures profound truths about liberation, justice, and dignity. But when myths are mistaken for literal history, when their problematic elements are taken as divine mandate rather than reflections of ancient cultural values, they can become dangerous. The Exodus story wasn't written for modern readers. It emerged in a world where gods were understood to use humans as pawns, where collective punishment was normal, where conquest was celebrated, and where tribal identity trumped universal human rights. It bears the moral limitations of its origins. Yet understanding the Exodus as myth rather than history doesn't diminish its power. If anything, it allows us to engage with it more honestly, to embrace its liberatory message while acknowledging its historical and ethical limitations. The story's endurance testifies to its resonance with something fundamentally human: the yearning for freedom, the hope that oppression is not the final word, the belief that even the most powerful empires cannot forever hold back the human spirit's drive toward dignity. Perhaps the most profound truth of the Exodus isn't about what happened in ancient Egypt at all. It's about what happens in the human heart when it dares to imagine liberation, when people find the courage to leave behind what enslaves them and journey toward a more just world. That journey continues today, and in that sense, whether the Red Sea ever parted or not, the Exodus is still unfolding.